Welcome one and all. Thanks so much for joining us here today for this really important dialogue entitled Making Cities a Home, Achieving Urban Land Reform. My name is Sumaya Hendricks and I will be co-moderating this dialogue today. I hail from the Dialogue and Advocacy team at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and my colleague Vern Harris, who is the Acting Chief Programs Officer, will be co-moderating the discussion here today. Please do not think that this is an official welcome. We really do value welcomes and want to make sure that you really do feel at home here with us today, even though we might be physically apart. And to do that, we have our CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Mr. Sello Hatang, who will be doing the official welcome as well as giving some opening remarks. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Mr. Sello Hatang.
Thank you very much, Sumaya, and thank you so much to all the panelists for being here today. Honorable Minister Patricia de Lille, Adv Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, esteemed speakers, as well as attendees that are joining us from South Africa and abroad. Dumelang, Sanbonani, and warm greetings from the Nelson Mandela Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this dialogue from wherever you may be joining us from around the world. I must say, I wasn't sure our dear advocate Ngcukaitobi was gonna make it today because of the cases he's been dealing with in recent times. We welcome the work you have been doing. The rule of law, as it is central to the work that we will be doing and part of the theme for today, must be central to our nation building project. In 2018, the Nelson Mandela Foundation embraced land reform as a key focus area for the Dialogue and Advocacy Unit, doing so in a year in which we celebrated the centenary of the birth of Madiba, is testament to the pivotal role that land reform plays in building the country that he dreamed and strove for. We recognize that when speaking about land reform, it may conjure up feelings of fear and anxiety for various reasons. Perhaps fear of the unknown, fear of misguided political interference, anxiety about mismanagement and poor policy design, perhaps even fear about one's own wealth and material well-being being impacted as a result of such reform. As South Africans, we need to realize that the way to deal with fear and anxiety about land reform is not to ignore or marginalize the discussion, but rather to embrace it. What should make us nervous is the absence of a structured, meaningful, and holistic approach to urban land reform and land reform more generally, because this is one of the biggest risks to our democracy. We believe that land reform is central to realizing a more just and equitable future and can be used as yardstick to measure our progress as a country. We cannot speak of a post-apartheid South Africa if our spatial composition and ownership still reflect apartheid, because so much of apartheid was about keeping people apart, inhibiting land ownership, and using land disposition as a tool for subjugation. As such, if what is just and equitable seems radical, that is indicative of the degree of which or to which our society is unjust and discriminatory. And we should bear this in mind as we engage on this subject matter. Madiba said that while South Africa is no different from other countries, in that we too have fought wars over land, unlike other countries, the dispossession of land was also part of the oppressive apartheid system that set us one against the other. By making most South Africans landless in the country of our birth, that system produced inequality, division, and poverty, Madiba argued. Today, the focus is on the urban dimension of land reform, which is especially important in the context of urbanization. I was made aware of a young Black woman who said that for Black people living in townships and informal settlements, it is as if they are living in the diaspora because they are so removed from land, so removed from South Africa. They feel discarded, forgotten, left out. At the foundation, we've seen how this notion of being a stranger in the land of one's own birth manifests itself in the provisioning of early childhood development services. For that, I want to again acknowledge the work that Sumaya has been doing in this space. For instance, land use schemes are often not developmental in nature and are applied uniformly and rigidly, which means ECD services, and in particular ECD centers in Orange Farm and Sandton are treated the same in terms of compliance, but clearly this equality is unfair. So the work we have to do around land reform needs to also extend to bylaws and other regulations which are biased against the poor and those with insecure land tenure. I want to give you one example. For example, one of the requirements is that you must have parking for parents as they come to pick up their kids. I don't know how realistic that is in a place where actually there's no space for you to demarcate parking like you would have in other urban centers. While there is a bouquet of options available to government, one mechanism is for government to make use of publicly owned land parcels. But for that to be possible, government must know what it owns. And that's also another challenge that we faced in our country, that land ownership and the parcels of land that are owned by government, even government doesn't know where that land is. While this mechanism in itself is not sufficient to achieve spatial transformation, it is an important tool, and putting it to the best possible use is vital. As such, we are honored to be hosting the Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure, Minister Patricia de Lille. I last saw you, Minister, in Cape Town many moons ago. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the foundation once we are open again. We are also pleased to be officially launching 3 papers today on urban land reform, aimed at stimulating informed discussion and debate on different models for urban land reform in South Africa. We can never forget that Advocate Ngcukaitobi just wrote his latest book on the same subject. We will be launching his book soon. Just look out for the information. We cannot leave to chance how we live and strive in cities. And I'm looking forward to hearing input from all our speakers here today with the hope of moving both the discussion and implementation forward. This dialogue also forms part of the Mandela Month activities, which this year is themed the rule of law and food for all. We also look forward to having the attendees here today join us for other events that form part of the series of engagements. I thank you very much. Over to you again, Sumaya.
Thanks so much, Mr. Hatang. So if you can hear my voice is a bit hoarse and a bit of congestion, don't worry, there isn't anything wrong with your sound. It is me. I'm actually in the process of recovering from COVID and almost back to full health. Also, don't worry, the foundation is not forcing me to work. I am here out of my own volition. But the reason why I actually wanted to mention this is that because we are living through a pandemic and there's no escaping that reality. And we know that many of you here today, while you are in this dialogue, your thoughts and your hearts are, I'm sure, with many of your loved ones, with your friends who may be sick, who may be in hospital. Some of you joining here with us today might be unwell yourself. And so we just really want to acknowledge that and say that both you and your families are in our thoughts and prayers. And we look forward to the next few months that hopefully we can see better days. Now, moving on to the business of today, I want to just give an overview about the program and around what you could expect. The program is divided into 2 parts. So the first part really entails launching these 3 urban land papers that the CEO made mention of. And in this first part of the program, we're going to be having the 2 organizations that accepted the call and really went out and dedicated significant of their expertise to writing these papers, give input. So the first input will be from Curaida Sal, who is a researcher at the Development Action Group, or DAG for short. The second input will be from Nonzamo Zondo, who is an attorney, as well as the executive director of the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, or short, SERI. That's the first part of the program. The second part of the program will entail a keynote address by Minister Patricia de Lille, who I'm sure everyone knows. She is the Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure since May 2019, and she's also been in all the spheres of government since 1994. After this keynote address, we will then be having a discussion between herself and Adv Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, who is a lawyer, public speaker, and author. He has authored a book, The Land is Ours, and as mentioned in April of this year, he published a new book called Land Matters, South Africa's Failed Land Reforms and the Road Ahead. And after this discussion between these two panelists, we then really want to engage with the public, and we will be taking comments and questions that you post through our platform. So if you're joining us through the Nelson Mandela Foundation events platform, you will see an option that says ask a question. Press on this if you have any comments, if you have any questions. Please tell us who you are. We'd love to know if you're from an organization and you're willing to share this with us, because we really want this to be an event for everyone that's joining us here today. So before I go over to our first contributor, I want to just give a little bit of a background to these urban land papers. So our CEO gave a bit of background around land and the foundation embracing urban land reform as a focus area. And in 2019, the foundation, we attended a conference at UWC where the focus was on rural land reform. And there was papers that was commissioned for the purposes of the conference. And at the foundation, as we reflected on this, we really wanted to see what are some of the ways in which we at the foundation could elevate the urban dimension of the land reform discourse. And so what we did is that inspired from this conference and at the papers that were launched, we then put out a call for urban land papers. And we had 3 submissions that were made. We had 2 from SERI, which they will be speaking to, and 1 from DAG. And we're really grateful for these organizations for heeding the call and for really, dedicating their expertise towards this. So we'll be sharing the link for these papers on the chat within the events platform. So please, we really hope you engage with them, read them, and I hope you within your various organizations and circles that in some way, whether in the policy space or the NGO space, that it is a means by which urban land reform and the various components contained within the papers can really be elevated, not only in thinking, but also in practice. So I think, let me stop there and hand over to our first contributor, which is Curaida from DAG. Over to you.
Thanks. Can you hear me clearly? Good afternoon, everybody. As Sumaya mentioned, my name is Curaida, and I represent DAG, an NGO working in the land and housing sector for over 30 years. In 2019, we submitted our paper on models of urban land reform to the Nelson Mandela Foundation. The model emerged through practice, that is via DAG's partnership with NASHO, the City of Cape Town, and others to implement the Woodstock Salt River Social Housing Program in 2017. There is clear evidence that the state itself and state-owned enterprises hold a significant number of strategically well-located land parcels and buildings which are underutilized or lying vacant. These land parcels have the potential to play an instrumental role in leveraging the much-needed call for urban land reform. At the 2019 State of the Nation address, the President rightly acknowledged the strategic role that these publicly owned land parcels could play in immediately kickstarting the urban land reform program, whilst also addressing the issue of spatially segregated apartheid cities. We propose a model of urban land reform built on the government's intent to leverage publicly owned land for the delivery of affordable, well-located rental housing in urban areas. To give effect to this, the state would need to boldly and proactively identify, pipeline, and transfer underutilized, well-located land and potentially buildings for the development of affordable rentable housing. This is to households earning below 15,000. By so doing, the state will be giving effect to its core responsibility of enabling spatial transformation through urban land redistribution. As we all know, location is key. The benefits for working class families living close to work opportunities, amenities, and facilities are undeniable. As a start, municipalities, national governments, departments, and SOEs must identify publicly owned land for affordable social housing through land audits, the result of which must be published in the National Public Land Register. After identification, available land must be assessed for its appropriateness for various development objectives. The government must intervene in dysfunctional property markets through the release of publicly owned land, either by selling the land, possibly at discounted rates, long-term lease, or through land availability agreements. Land can be released through intergovernmental transfers, and when municipal land is made available to social housing institutions or SHIs through smart partnership agreements, and in the case of private developers, through joint venture agreements. Government departments in the disposal of land must consider whether any other department requires the land. If so, available land must be donated to a municipality in need of land for housing development. Alternatively, land might be disposed of at discounted rates. Once municipalities have acquired the land, they must publish the intention to construct affordable housing on the sites and invite suitable and accredited SHIs and appropriate private partners to bid for the housing development project, including management of the social housing stock. Municipalities must assess submitted proposals and select the SHI or private partners most suitable to implement the project. All parties must reach agreement of exactly how the project will be rolled out, which can be set out in property development plans and project delivery plans. Additionally, the following steps must be taken in terms of policy and budgetary amendments. Municipalities must detail land acquisition development plans and strategies in the integrated development plans and spatial development frameworks. Although municipal strategic planning documents such as the IDPs and the SDFs require that municipalities identify where they would like to see development happen, not enough emphasis is placed on ensuring that municipalities include a land acquisition and development plan or strategy in their planning documents. Secondly, land use management bylaws and future provincial SPLUMA legislation must explicitly require municipalities to include land acquisition and development plans and strategies. Also, the Urban Settlement Developments Grant must be expanded beyond its current use for infrastructure projects to allow for land acquisition and development. Fourthly, the government must create a separate funding stream alongside the USDG for the planning for the acquisition and development of land for housing development. And finally, the government must identify a single department primarily responsible and accountable for the planning, acquisition, and development of land for human settlement purposes and the management of funds allocated for this purpose. National Treasury must support municipalities through capacity building and training in order to equip implementing agents to give effect to the proposed model of urban land reform. Similarly, municipalities must support housing beneficiaries to understand the objectives of social housing, how it interlinks with the National Housing Program, the 10-year security arrangements, and their financial responsibilities in relation to payment of rentals, amongst others. Finally, a range of stakeholders must be involved in unlocking well-located public land and land for affordable social housing development purposes. In conclusion, our model calls on the release of well-located vacant and unused public land so that it can be put to best use and in the public interest, i.e. the development of social housing. President Ramaphosa himself said, there can be no greater injustice than a society where some live in comfort and plenty while others struggle on the margins of society with little or nothing at all. It is inconceivable that land parcels owned by the public sector and which the government of the day is merely the custodian of, should lie vacant and unused, while millions of citizens live in overcrowded informal settlements and backyards, and others wait for 20 or more years to access state-subsidized housing that puts them far away from jobs, schools, and other basic elements needed to live a decent life. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Curida. I really encourage everyone to go and have a look at that paper. DAG really draws on not just theory, but they actually do this work in practice. So it's really nice that they've brought to the public arena drawing on both the theoretical, but then also the practical implementation and their experience. Before I hand over to Sis Nzamo, who is the second contributor from SERI for our paper, I want to just remind everyone, we really want this to be a dialogue where there is a two-way communication. So please, if you're joining us on the Nelson Mandela events page, you will see on the top, it should be towards the middle of the page, it says ask a question. You can press ask a question if you have a question, or if you just have comments, and please let us know who you're directing the question towards so that we can direct it to the relevant person. We'd really love to get you involved in this dialogue. So let me hand over to Sis Nzamo from SERI.
Thank you so much, Sumaya. Firstly, I'd just like to pass SERI's gratitude for the partnership with the Nelson Mandela Foundation on these two papers on security of tenure and urban land reform, which have been a big part of SERI's work since our inception. And we, in drafting these papers, we drew on our experience, of course, but I want to take everybody back to those early days. Just as in April 1994, as people stood in queues to vote, all of us knew that the land question had to be resolved. In fact, I know that at that time, those who wanted to be in government already had figured out there must be a master plan to resolve the challenges around land. And fortunately, that master plan ended up being part of our constitution, firstly in the form of Section 25.5, which said that from on the onset, the government would take legislative and other measures to ensure that people have equitable access to land, meaning that it won't just simply be for those who have money who can buy into the market to be able to access land. Secondly, it said that as citizens, we would be entitled to security of tenure, or at the very least comparable redress because of our past. And together with those provisions, already there was an understanding that there would have to enshrine the right to housing, and there would have to be a commitment for progressive realization of that right, together with a prohibition against arbitrary evictions. And looking at that framework in 1994, and as a master plan, so actually we can resolve what was then huge problems of land dispossession of landlessness. And I'm sure at that time all of us were filled with hope. And immediately after the constitution came into effect, there was legislation that was put in place to protect people's tenure. Yes, at that time it was mostly negative, and I know that the PI Act, which many property owners complain about, was one of the pieces of legislation that came out of that process to make sure that at the very least South Africans or people within the boundaries of South Africa have protection around tenure. And the plan at that time was that there would be legislation that would make sure that there's more permanent protections, but also positive protections of the right to access to land. And we, unfortunately, for some reason, there is a 20-year delay, a 20-year lag, where there's complete silence around urban land reform. And we are grateful again for the work that was done by the high-level panel that was chaired by former President Motlanthe, which started to now pick up how do we continue the project of urban land reform? How do we take forward this master plan? And already at the high-level panel said, actually what we need to start, we need an urban land redistribution framework, which would then set for us how we address urban land reform. And in drafting these papers, SERI said, as Corridor was even mentioning earlier, there are many players who are who have a role to play within urban land reform in all three spheres of government. Sometimes you have, even in the national sphere, you have the Department of Human Settlements, you have the Ministry and the Department of Public Works, you have the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform. And there's a question about then who carries this very, very important task for the South African government. And the paper proposes that we should establish an Office of Equitable Access, which will coordinate implementation of the legislation and policies that try to push for equitable access to land. And in that, we felt that within human settlements, already at the time of the drafting of the papers, there was an attempt to review the policies that were in place, and we thought that would be a good time to look at, to actually develop an equitable access strategy and mechanisms that the Department of Human Settlement could champion around urban land reform. As we do now, we know the important role that must be played by expropriation to ensure that there is a land that could be passed on to the landless in this country. And again, there are questions, and I think Curator has addressed these beautifully, questions around the rental housing market. The fact that before democracy, we had the Rent Control Act, which actually made sure there was a steady supply of affordable rental accommodation to white South Africans, which we do not have now. And as Curator addressed this, there is an issue about how we have social housing institutions, but these at the moment do not cater for people who earn below 3,500 Rand. And part of the measures that we're suggesting is a down market reach, where the social housing institutions don't just only cater for those who earn from 3.5 and above, but actually that you take it down to make sure that people who can pay rentals of 300 Rand and 600 Rand are actually able to get a rental accommodation. But also more importantly, there is a need to regulate the private market, to make sure the private market doesn't only supply those who have needs. So that is on the one hand a place where it might be a long-term plan when we can address the issue of urban land reform. But then there's issues about what do we do now? We are 20 years late, or even longer than that. What do we do in this moment to make sure that we're actually taking steps towards land reform and land distribution? And I'm just going to speak to 2 points. One of them, Curator has addressed beautifully, which is the disposal of underutilized state land, which would be useful for making sure that people who are living in informal settlements, or people who are living in inner city buildings, have well-located land. Again, in the urban setting, location is everything, because we know the closer you are to economic opportunities, the less likely it is that you can go to bed hungry. The closer you are to economic opportunities, again, we know you have more chances of getting employed. But I'm going to focus more on the role that municipalities can play right now, today, with existing legislative measures and with existing policies to actually further our country's land distribution goals. Firstly, we know, and as Greta has mentioned, we actually need municipalities now, today, to start setting goals for equitable access to land. Make sure that they have this in their IDPs. Secondly, they have the power under Section 9.3 of the Housing Act to actually start expropriating land for housing purposes, for as long as the land will be used through in a plan, in a program that is already accounted for in that housing code. Then they have the power to expropriate using that, and of course, the Ministry of Public Works would facilitate that. Thirdly, we know throughout this time we've had challenge of evictions as a country. And fortunately, again, the jurisprudence led us to a point where we have the emergency housing program, which opens the door wide for municipalities to assist communities that are threatened with eviction through funding that is provided in the emergency housing program. And if we have an approach that focuses not only on providing temporary accommodation to evictees, where we consider upgrading as the first response of people who are threatened with eviction, would be able to take forward our goals. Two, if we're in a position to actually provide, yes, move people to alternative land, but with a lens to have them there permanently. And then lastly, municipalities with the support of COPTA and the Department of Human Settlements could then actually sponsor and champion urban land distribution cases where they can show how we can do this as a country. And I think it's very, very important to point out that because we have in this room the Ministry of Public Works, there's a role that ministry can play in overseeing the work of the distribution to see, are municipalities using their powers of expropriation? If they are, how first of all, are they addressing issues of land tenure? Two, how are they redistributing land and to who? It is, if we think about tenure, we know we have existing mechanisms that could be used as we speak today. But one of the things that is the biggest problem is that we actually don't know how big the problem is because we don't have the records. Just as in 1994, if you are not someone who holds title, both municipalities, provinces, and even national government does not see you. So it's very, very important to actually provide for a continuum of tenure, where you don't simply only recognize the owner, but also you go forward and you recognize those that are occupying or using pieces of land as a way for us to be able to measure what the situation is and also be able to see how we can improve people's tenure. Secondly, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, is really the question of the norms and standards around rental housing and rental housing policy, where pre-1994, we had a process where rental increases could be kept, where you could have within areas amounts of what is acceptable rental. But unfortunately now the market is unchecked and leaving to a lot of people being pushed outside of the market. And we actually do need urgently to address the obligation placed on the Ministry of Human Settlements to have norms and standards in place for rental housing in South Africa. Again, here I want to speak to what do we do today? What can we do today that will respond to this? We know that outside of PI, the only other tool that government has used to provide to redistribute land in urban settings has been subsidized housing, and of course that must continue. Again, we bring out the issue of settled land occupations, of managed land occupations, as a way to balance the land needs in the country. Who we have through SPLUMA, as mentioned, through even litigation processes where municipalities can actually start to build records for this Land Rights Recordal Act, where actually they can tell us in unlawfully occupied buildings who are the occupiers vis-a-vis the owner. So you have scope to actually start building this tenure continuum. And it would be beautiful, I think, if municipalities could start now to start collaborating with civil society actors, with practitioners, to actually start building land records in this country that go to what is actually happening on the ground, instead of us only being consumed with the title system that we have in the country, which only caters for only 40% of our population. Let's actually start focusing on what is happening on the ground. And lastly, I'd just like to say that the one thing that municipalities can do again today through the use of SPLUMA is remove the unlawfulness of informal settlement. Through SPLUMA, acknowledge them and recognize them as special zones, which would then again go back to a situation where we are accepting that everyone that is here in the country has a right to be here. And because they have a right to here, we recognize them and we are then taking steps to redistribute the land. Thank you so much, Sumaya.
Thanks so much, Susana Nzamo. There was so much that you said, and I again encourage everyone to please go and see the two papers that SERI has written. We are posting it on the events platform, so if you're watching from there, you will see the link. And again, to remind people, if you have questions, you can please feel free to ask them. press on the Ask the Question button. Even if you don't have a question, but you have a comment, please feel free to make those comments. If you have a question for a particular speaker, when you are asking your question, if you could maybe just say who you'd like us to direct that speaker, that question to, we'd appreciate that. And I think just a few things I wanted to just pick up on what Sister Nzamo had said, is this idea that we need to ask ourselves, what can we do today? And we must push ourselves, and thinking around who do we need to champion urban land reform. And one of the things, which is why also we're really grateful to have the minister here with us for availing herself. And one thing I want to pick up, which is an anecdote, is that when the presidential task team was set up to look at expropriation and land, and we hosted one of a think tank. We tried to put together grassroots organizations because we wanted to make sure that their voices were really heard. And as an anecdote, one of the land activists that we had in the room said that the only reason why we need title deed is because those who have title deed bully us, those who don't have. And just really speaking to the issue of title deed that Sister Nzamo raised. But let me leave it there. Really looking forward to the rest of the engagement. And on that note, let me hand over to my co-moderator, who's Professor Vern Harris, who is the acting Chief Programs Officer at the Nelson Mandela Foundation.
Thank you, Sumaya, and greetings, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome Minister Patricia de Lille to this platform. It's great to be working with you in this role as Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure. We worked with you when you were Mayor of Cape Town, and during your long and distinguished career as a parliamentarian. And of course, we don't forget your previous life as a social justice activist through the apartheid and transition periods. Minister, over to you, and thank you again.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that I'm unmuted. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. May I greet Salo Hatang. I agree, it's a long time no see. The CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, continue with the good work that you are doing. Sumaya Hendricks, the Acting Dialogue and Advocacy Manager at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Oh, somebody that I really admire and is very proud of, Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, a senior counsel and also acting judge at the Land Court. I don't mind debating with you, Advocate, but I feel sorry for your learned friends, your opponents in the courts, when you really clobber them. So continue with the good work. Professor Vern Harris, who's the Acting Programs Officer of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Nomzamo Zondo, the Executive Director of the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa. And of course, Corrida Sal, researcher at DAG. And all the representatives from government that are on the program today, civil society organizations, and also members of the media. Thank you for the invitation to address this engagement on a topic that I feel very passionate about. And I must also state up front that I fully agree with the theme for this engagement, making cities a home. Indeed, there's a great need to accelerate urban land reform, not only as a matter of redress, but also in the context of rapid urbanization. I agree with the findings of the studies, and specifically the studies state that there's clear evidence that the state is itself and state-owned enterprises hold a significant number of strategically well-located land parcels, which is large enough for infill site and buildings which are underutilized and are lying vacant. I further agree that these land parcels have the potential to play an instrumental role in leveraging the much needed call for urban land reform and correcting the apartheid spatial planning. And I want to commend the Nelson Mandela Foundation and its partners for conducting these studies. What we need to do now is to take these studies together with the recommendations of the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and come together and start implementing the recommendations of the panel. In 2019, I established a reference group headed by Professor Ruth Hall to assist my department with implementing the recommendations of the Advisory Panel on Land Reform. And the reference group includes PLAS from the University of the Western Cape, the African Center for Cities at University of Cape Town, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute, the South African Cities Networks from Wits University, and the Funa Nkwasi, the South African Local Government Association, and others. I must admit that because of the pandemic, we have not met as frequently as we want to, but the outputs expected from the reference group are, amongst others, to advise on land reform and infrastructure planning. Government has accepted the majority of the recommendations of the advisory panel, of which Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi SE was also part of. We must acknowledge that we have not done well in dealing with apartheid spatial planning. In fact, we continue to perpetuate by building houses even further away because we were using cheap land far away from the city centers. The result is that we have taken our people further away from opportunities and well-located land, especially in the cities. Large-scale housing projects on the periphery of our cities and towns have been perpetuated over the years in the name of addressing the demand for housing, but this has only led to the escalation of spatial dysfunction and urban sprawl. The disconnection from functioning urban centers of many of these large-scale housing projects, which do not have any economic activities or even social facilities close by, and where those living do not have access to public transport, has forced many families into greater levels of poverty. Many years after the demise of the apartheid, the majority of the poor and vulnerable still remain on the outskirts of our cities. And together with the rapid urbanization, there's a great need for us to push harder to make more well-located land available in our urban areas. It is estimated that by 2050, at least 70% of the global population will live in urban areas. In Africa alone, there will be nearly 800 million more people living in our cities than today. So we need to do a lot more to create inclusive and integrated communities in well-located areas, close to transport, close to job opportunities, as we know that the poor people spend today more than 40% of their income just on transport. Despite legislative and policy interventions to eradicate this inequality since democracy in 1994, the skewed pattern of ownership remains today. Let me deal with what I see as the role of the state in land reform. And I will zone in on the role of the Department of Public Works, as that is the mandate that I must carry out. We have the opportunity as government to not perpetuate the past, but to build integrated urban communities and begin to address the vast inequalities of our past and simultaneously respond to the pressures of urbanization. And we can do this by optimizing well-located state land that will be able, together with the private sector, build functional cities and neighborhoods as opposed to just delivering houses. A key recommendation from the advisory panel relevant to the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure is regarding state-owned land, where the panel stated that the processes to identify land for redistribution should include an effective mapping of all available state land. The panel noted that the Department of Public Works has already identified its properties, both rural and urban, that are potentially available for redistribution for agricultural and non-agricultural purposes. The panel further stated that assistance from public works and other government departments should be given to other state institutions to undertake similar exercises. I agree fully, however, but it is not just national government which owns land. We must access the asset registers to see the land that is available under the ownership of all the cities, towns, and provinces to assist accelerating land reform, as they often sell off well-located land to developers and then look to national government for land. And this is why my call is that provincial and local governments should also conduct an audit of their available land in urban areas, so that we have a complete view of the asset register of all three spheres of government. And that also includes the asset register of state-owned entities. Now, due to the small percentage of land that's owned by the state, Department of Public Works has also started engaging with state-owned entities to bring their land on their registers and contribute that so that we can speed up land reform. We are making progress. We have done an audit and we've got all the land parcels that is under the Department of Public Works, of the Department of Public Enterprises. I've got that list already. I've written to all the other government departments with state-owned entities to also submit their audit of all the land owned by state-owned entities, like the post office and many other state-owned entities. And I can assure you, I was shocked to see the amount of especially well-located land that is owned by state-owned entities. So the National Development Plan also addresses the need to break down the apartheid geography through, amongst others, land reform by releasing spatially just public land and property. So I'm mentioning all of this because we have got enough plans, we've got enough policies, we've got the legislative framework. The challenge really is implementation. And to understand and change the way land is being owned and managed and to redistribute it to the landless and the land-hungry South Africans, the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform undertook 2 land audits to look at the extent of colonial and dispossession and apartheid forced removals. But I think another land audit is due because the first one took place in 2013. And the first one was to determine the amount of land owned by the state or in private ownership. And the second audit at only land in private ownership. So the 13-14 land audit found that 79% of South African land was in private ownership, 14% owned by the state, and 7% was unaccounted for. The audit also looked at land in private ownership and found that individuals, companies, and trusts have a combined ownership of 90% of the total land audited. Then the audit in 2017 in terms of farms and agricultural holdings, revealed that whites own 72% of agricultural land, followed by coloreds at 15%, followed by Indians at 5%, and blacks at 4%, and other unidentified by race at 3%, and co-owners at 1%. So another finding of the 2017 audit found that categorized it by race in urban areas, that Africans now own 30% in urban areas, whites 49%, coloreds 8%, and Indian 5%. So, as also the advisory panel stated and noted, that land distribution so far has mainly focused on agriculture and has had little focus on urban needs and rapid urbanization. So that's why your study is so important. And to address this, there's indeed a massive role for the state to play. And the state not only speaks to a national government, but to all three spheres of government who own land collectively. We've got a collective responsibility to work together on this. So from this above statistics on land ownership, it is clear that the state owns a small percentage of land, as the majority of the land is in private ownership. So one of the key recommendations of the advisory panel on land reform was also that a new land audit need to be conducted to identify all unused state land that is not earmarked for particular developments. And that include land belonging to all three spheres of government. The panel had also recommended that we need to define state-owned land within municipality jurisdiction for urban resettlement. So I agree fully, as the last land audit was done only the last time in 27. Now, I briefly want to turn to the Government Immovable Asset Management Act, GEHAMA, because GEHAMA makes the public works a key custodian of state-owned land. And in terms of public works, we have different ways of disposal of land and property. Namely, we can sell some property, we can exchange property and land, we can make donations to NGOs, or we can lease in terms of the government's Immovable Asset Management Act of 2007. The only problem is that I discovered that even though the act was enacted in 2007, that there's no regulations yet for the act. And I have started the process, and through the Office of the State Attorney, we have appointed a service provider to help us to draw up the regulations for GEHAMA. So GEHAMA has to provide for a uniform framework for the management of an immovable asset that is held or is used by a national or a provincial department. GEHAMA is also there to ensure the coordination and the use of an immovable asset with the service delivery objective of national or provincial government. And is there also to provide for the issuing of guidelines and minimum standards in respect of immovable asset management by national government or provincial government. So we are busy with the drafting of the regulations. I think there's also an opportunity because there are a lot of conflicting legislation, especially when it comes to the value of a property. The GEHAMA Act doesn't speak about market value. It speaks about best value. But then you also have got a land affairs board that was established in terms of an act of 1987 that must determine the value of land before disposal. Then you also have the evaluated general. So there's a whole mix of pieces of legislation that doesn't speak to each other. Let me briefly deal with the three types of land reform quickly. A land restitution, like we all know, is very important because it's an indictment that we haven't settled all the land restitution claims that were submitted before 1998. So I can only speak for what we have contributed as Public Works in the past 2 years. We have contributed 159 rural properties measuring about 17,430 hectares. And we plan some more for the next financial year. Then we also are busy with the redistribution of land for two purposes, the one for agriculture purposes and the other one for human settlements. So what we have done is to release all the agricultural land to the Department of Rural Development for the purposes of Black emerging farmers. And as you know, during the month of May, we handed over 31 title deeds to farmers, Black farmers and their spouses in Limpopo. The department has also contributed a total of 125 properties measuring more than 25,000 hectares for the program, covering all 9 provinces for agricultural purposes. Then our program for the redistribution of land for human settlements. Now, the land from the Department of Public Works that's on our books that we have transferred so far and what we are still in the process of transferring is that we are transferring the land to the Housing Development Agency. We give them the power of attorney to start the planning of housing developments on those pieces of land. So 52 parcels of land totaling more than 3,000 hectares were processed for human settlements. We've also contributed another 30 properties measuring more than 2,614 hectares in the 2021 financial year. And in the last year also, DPWI also contributed to infrastructure development. So 15 hectares of land parcels were approved for registration of roads, water, electricity, and so on. And just what we are busy with now in the 2021-22 financial year, we will be distributing 10,000 hectares for land restitution, 10,951 hectares for human settlements, and 180 hectares for socioeconomic purposes. Just to illustrate, as part of GIHAMA, DPWI can also dispose of land to NGOs for socioeconomic purposes. So over the past 2 years, we've released 12 properties in Gauteng and in the Western Cape for the use of shelters for gender-based violence victims. The department has also leased land in urban areas to small-scale farming, urban farming within cities. And then we also, of course, provide land to state-owned entities like ESCOM for servitudes and so on. And also to SANRAL for the purposes of national roads improvement. Now, I will be the first to admit that we can improve and we can bring in more urgency into the whole land reform program. If we can begin to reduce the red tape and begin to really, like it's happening in the past 2 years in the 6th administration, where land reform is priority number 1 for government. Then, now, I want to turn to the call by many activists for the release of military land in the city of Cape Town. I too supported the call as I made a call to national government when I was still the mayor of the city of Cape Town, to release this well-located land to respond to urbanization. But now I'm a member of the Interministerial Committee, and together with the Minister of Human Settlements, the Minister of Land Reform, and the Minister of Defense, we then, after toing and froing whether the land should be released or not released, we decided to do a site visit. So as the three ministers, we visited Youngsfield, Wingfield, Eistelplaat military sites, and all those military sites are currently in the custodianship of the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure. And then as we visited these properties, the Department of Defense then illustrated to us and showed us how they are still utilizing these properties, but they also showed pieces of the properties that could possibly be released for human settlements like in Wingfield. So in January, we took the joint site visit. We also determined how much land is being utilized by the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense had concerns about their own operational activities. So that is where we are right now. The Minister of Defense must now take a report to Cabinet for a final decision on the military land. So I thought I would just let you know about that. Then we are also doing some precinct developments. But the last part that I want to address you as part of my, not only of my performance agreement with the President, but the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure is also responsible for starting the work on the first new city that we'll build in our new democracy. So we started the process. We have embarked on a process of determining the parameters for a new city for South Africa that is based on a framework that drives spatial integration with spatial transformation as an outcome. And the framework is now being developed through a study and an intensive research and consultation process, which will culminate in a strategy and action plan for a new democratic city in South Africa. The study has commenced and will, in the next few months, the framework is grounded in an overall aim of establishing an urban nexus that reverses South African fragmented urban paths with a bold vision for more equitable urban future in the world's most rapidly urbanizing continent. And this opportunity is once in a lifetime opportunity to transform our cities. Cities are the drivers of change and they are the engine rooms of our economies. Therefore, we must bring people closer to cities to stop the urban sprawl by integrating our cities and once and for all, bring and speed up urban land reform. Now, I released a book in 2017 called A View from the City Hall on reflections of governing the city of Cape Town. And in the book, I said, the Mandela government embarked on an ambitious program of providing 1 million houses within 5 years. The resources, the industry participation, and project planning and delivery that this required was massive, but it was for the most part delivered within the projected timeframes. However, in spatial and economic terms, we are feeling the consequences of that policy decision in our cities in ways that do not best an urban agenda of densification and the efficient use of space amongst the myriad of the other effects. So public works plays an integral role in urban land reform. We must ensure that public land is used for public good. And the success of our land reform program in our urban areas should therefore not be measured only in terms of the number of hectares of land transferred and redistributed to those that were previously disadvantaged, but also in terms of the qualitative spin-offs and the creation of integrated community. So lastly, as you all know, the advisory panel also advised that the 1975 Expropriation Act must be repealed and replaced. And we took that call very serious in Public Works. And in October 2019, we have submitted the first draft bill to Parliament, and it's now before Parliament for processing. I will deal with the other issues when we deal with questions, but I'm really putting forward an invitation that, you know, the civil society, all stakeholders, you know, we've got a duty, we've got a patriotic duty to work together. That's why I enjoyed the book by Advocate. You know, the land is ours, Israel. I agree with you 100%. I must now still read your second book, because we must find that new, innovative, creative ideas to move forward together as a country. We cannot further delay land reform in our country. I thank you once again for the opportunity, and thank you for listening to me. Sorry I took a bit of time, but I'm prepared to take further questions. Thank you so much, Program Director.
Thank you, Minister, for this keynote, and thank you for agreeing to engage with Advocate Ngcukaitobi. I don't think many cabinet ministers would agree to this kind of conversation. So we really appreciate that. Hardly need to introduce Tembeka, you know, probably South Africa's busiest and most visible advocate, highly respected public intellectual and scholar. With respect to my colleagues, I don't think they've punted this new book. You know, here it is. And as you can see, I've been reading it and making notes. It's a really valuable addition to public discourse, and it makes accessible some of these complex issues. I don't know where you get the time for this, Tembeka, and I just hope that the book that you're working on about Madiba as a lawyer hasn't been put on the back burner, because we're really looking forward to that book. But without further ado, what I'm going to do now is ask Tembeka to engage with the minister for about 25 minutes. It's now 17:38, so if you could be looking to wrap it by about 4:05, so we can give opportunity for some of the questions being addressed by audience members. So over to you, Tembeka. Thank you.
Thank you, Van, and thank you, Minister. I'm also a big fan of yours from your time in our common organization. Although I've now sold out, as you can hear, I'm even writing a book about Mandela. But I also want to thank the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Silo Hatang, an old friend and an old comrade, and really doing an excellent job steering the ship in these difficult times. And Sumaya Hendricks, who's got the vision, the intellectual ability, the energy to drive these programs. Nomzamo is also a comrade within the NGO circles, and we've been, together in the land and housing space. I think I'm meeting Kerida for the first time, but I was very pleased to hear the insights that she was sharing with us. Minister, I'm hoping, as you called, in fact, I think you've disarmed me, because once you've said you're making an invitation, that this must be a collaborative effort, then all of my ability to punch, just dissipated. So I will also play in a very collaborative spirit. I think you are a very experienced politician and a very smart one. So I'm disarmed from the beginning. Can I just ask you, what are the numbers that you are working from? So I was looking at this yesterday, in terms of homelessness in Gauteng, that there are now approximately 30,000 people that are quote unquote sleeping rough in Gauteng. And there are only 1,000 beds available in shelters. What are your numbers on the national picture or even the Gauteng picture?
Minister, you're muted.
Unmuting myself, yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Well, thank you for that question. What I have got access to is the number of people that are on the waiting list of the provinces and also of our cities.
Yes.
Now, those are the people on the waiting list. Then you have got, because of urbanization, you've got the city of Cape Town and the city of Johannesburg are the fastest growing cities. And you've got informal settlements all over the place where people are also waiting for housing. Then you have also a number of people living in backyards waiting for housing. So the waiting list really, it is tremendous and it's very, very, very high. That does not even include the homeless that you mentioned, which should also be included on those waiting lists. So this is how government is structured. You've got the Department of Human Settlements, Water and Sanitation that are responsible for looking at the type of top structures, whether it is RDP, whether it is gap housing. I've now entered the space of gap housing through the infrastructure department. And then they also have got access to the government subsidies. And as you know, people that qualify for government subsidies must earn less than 3,500 a month. My role is to scope and to look at the government's immovable asset register and release the land to the Department of Human Settlements to actually build the top structure. And that is where the connection comes in. So I can give you an example whereby there is nowhere in South Africa with a coastline of over 3,000 kilometers. You hardly find affordable, well-located, either in the form of flats or units close by or walking distance from the ocean. So here's an example. In the city of Cape Town, there is a big 1777. I went to the mayor of the city of Cape Town and to HDA and say, listen, we can release this over 800 hectares, but we must get the guarantee that it must be a mixed development. It must bring our own people closer also to that. And then we work together. Yes. So to cut the long answer short, Advocate, is that the numbers is in the domain of, and how to deal with those numbers is with the Minister of Human Settlements.
Yes,
I must supply the land.
Yeah, no, I understand. But does the government, whether it's you or housing, do they actually have the figure of homeless people in the country, or you wouldn't know?
I've only seen some figures now with COVID-19, because yes, with COVID-19, I've made some intervention in some of the cities whereby we made public works land available to the city of Tshwane, the city of Cape Town, even in eThekwini, we made some land available for the municipalities to cater for the homeless during the period of COVID. But I'm sure those figures must be available.
Yes. Now, thank you. And then also just on the issue of the numbers, just to make sure we understand the scale of the problem. So yeah, when I looked at the figures by the World Bank, I think it was a 2018 report, they spoke of 62% urban migration since 1994, which seems to show that actually the homelands are just being abandoned at an astonishing rapid pace. What are your figures there?
No, they definitely correct.
Yes.
In South Africa, by 2030, which is around the corner, we will see at least between 60 and 70% of the country's population living in cities. Now, you know, I've got a special soft spot for people who migrate. You know, people are sitting in a very hopeless situation in the rural areas, no income, no access to services. And that person say, I am going to get up myself and go and look for opportunities in the cities. So we need to welcome people who migrate through urbanization that come to the cities. And we need to, although our cities have not been designed for the numbers that we see in our cities now, but we must be more creative and having plans that can accommodate, you know, the people moving to the cities, instead of, you know, accusing people of calling them names like economic migrants and all of that. Urbanization is a reality, and it's a reality all over the world. Yes. And especially in Africa. You can see in Africa, in Addis Ababa, whether you go to Accra in Ghana or to Abuja or Lagos, you will see the urbanization of how African people are moving towards the cities.
Yes. And out of those, I mean, one of the other things they speak about in that report is one of the problems is not internal migration, it's also people coming from outside, and they are competing for very, very little available housing opportunities. I mean, are you able to break down what the numbers look like? The competition for this limited resource called the shelter, which is causing a social friction, which then germinates this idea that, you know, you are an economic migrant, and then sometimes xenophobic as well.
I agree with you. Certainly, there's the competition for scarce resources. But one research that we have done in my previous life when I was the mayor was to do a research to see how many of the original owners that received a subsidy from government are still in those subsidy HDP homes.
Yes.
And very, very disappointing. More than 87, 89% are no longer in those houses. And that's where an informal housing sales has developed, because some of those houses that were built on subsidy income for the owners was sold off, and in many instances it was sold off to foreigners. So it's very difficult to keep up and to make sure that all of those people first that are on the waiting list. When it comes to the waiting list, another problem is that there's a big fight about who was first on the waiting list. Yes. And the people are allowed to jump the queue because of corrupt politicians, because they take money and put people in front of the queue. And so when it comes to social housing and and RDP housing and all of that. There are lots of conflicts that's taking place there all the time, including, of course, the xenophobic tendencies that we've seen.
Yes, and just that last part on the actual numbers is, do we know the number of people living in informal settlement in the country? I mean, so the informal is usually basically two types. Those are people living in shacks and backyard dwellers. Are we able to distinguish people who are in shacks versus those that are in backyard?
Well, I think most of the metropolitan cities will have that information.
No, I understand. I'm thinking about
yes.
government nationally. Yeah.
And nationally, I don't want to thumb suck. I know it is quite a big number, but I haven't checked it, you know, say in the past 3-4 months. My focus is really been on getting land out as soon as possible. And maybe I think that one thing that you must look at, Advocate, is the whole issue of evaluation of properties. And how do you arrive at a value? Because even in some instances, the court has now ruled against some of the evaluations by the valuation general. And then in public works, I've got this Land Affairs Board, 1987 Act, who also must determine the value of land. And if we want equitable land distribution, as government, we are at the stage now whereby we no longer sell land between the 3 spheres of government, but all land is released on a gratis basis amongst the 3 spheres of government. So why should we then still have a need to do an valuation before you dispose of the land?
Yes.
But it is a requirement in terms of GIAMA.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we can park then the issue of what exactly are the statistics looking at and look at the point you are raising now, which is the how the government acquires land. Do you actually have a policy on land acquisition? What policy do you follow? I've seen the policy of the Department of Land Affairs. It's changed over time, but I've seen that policy, but I've never seen the Public Works policy.
Well, I think my first task now is that I need to look, and I am looking at, first of all, government doesn't have a functional, electronic, digital, immovable asset register.
Yeah.
So, because it's very easy for people to steal a file with a title deed than to get it, you know, off an electronic system. So that is my first priority, so that we can at least have a baseline that you can see exactly what we own. I can tell you we don't know exactly what we own all over the country. So that is the first priority.
Yes.
The second one is that I see expropriation as another method of acquisition.
Yes, yes.
Because currently you've got the president, at least 7 national ministers, all the premiers, all the municipalities, they all have powers to expropriate.
Yes.
And I'm also looking at expropriation for the purposes as an acquisition way. But I hope that, you know what, and I know it's going to be challenged at some stage, and it's probably in the Constitutional Court, but I'm quite confident that the expropriation bill, as it is before Parliament, is constitutional, and the State Law Advisor has also confirmed that. But you know, in your latest book, Advocate, I also like to ask questions.
Yes, let me just ask one more question. I mean, on the one thing, I mean, I'm interested in what the data is that you are working from, and I'm also interested what your policy framework is. But I just want to ask one more thing, and then you can ask me a question. One more thing about the policy that you are actually following. My experience, having engaged with housing, public works, and land affairs, is that there's a lot of confusion about the valuation of properties.
Yes.
And people are doing different things.
Yes.
And sometimes properties are paid at much higher than market value.
Yes.
And I've never actually seen them when they're paid below market value. Often it's market and above. What is the reason for that?
The reason for the confusion is one, that the Government Immovable Asset Management Act of 2007 does not speak about market value.
Yes.
This market value is sneaked in by officials.
Yes.
And National Treasury, because National Treasury want to see market value, but it is not in legislation, it's not in the act at all. So that is the first confusion. The second part is, how do you determine the value of a property?
Yes.
And that confusion comes from this old 1987 Land Affairs Board.
Yes.
I was forced to re-establish the Land Affairs Board now because it's still on the statute book. Then the other confusion, Advocate, is that there was the South African Law Review Commission or panel early in 2008, 2009.
Yes.
And they have suggested a list of legislation that need to be repealed and removed that's in conflict with our 1996 Constitution.
Yes.
We've still not removed those. I'm now coming with a Public Works General Law Amendment Bill to just repeal all of those things en masse. Because they're still on the statute books, you still have to consider them. So that is the other confusion when it comes to valuation. But for now, the disposal between the spheres of government is on a gratis basis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because one of the things about this idea of confusion, again, if we can just stick to it for a moment, is that unless you have one comprehensive piece of legislation that you follow to acquire, officials will do whatever they want to do. But most importantly, the Public Works Department will do things differently from Land Affairs.
That's true.
Now, when you apply the new bill, which is a very promising start, I've actually been encouraging of the new expropriation bill, that it should be passed as soon as possible, but it's hotly opposed. Everybody says, property value is going to destroy the economy, etc. But here's my problem. If you look at section 2 and 3 of this bill, it's confined to the Department of Public Works. And the function of the Department of Public Works is to acquire land for state use, not to acquire land for wider redistribution, for land reform purposes. Now, how is this bill actually going to work for land reform purposes? Because your function is acquisition for state use, not acquisition for redistribution to the public.
No, you're correct. It's acquisition for state use.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they then need to, within the various, depending on the need and which department it is, it must be only for state use.
Yeah.
But, until such time, we know exactly what we own and where and how this can be utilized for what purpose. That's why another piece of that's important is the new spatial development framework. It has gone through a long process of public consultation. It is aligned to the Spatial Land Use Management Act, the Plumer Act. When that piece of spatial, the spatial development framework is adopted by government, it will guide all of us at all three spheres of government, what can be built where and on which land. So all of those things are beginning to come together that can deal with what you say is the confusion.
Don't we just need then, if it's clear that the Expropriation Act as it is not going to give me land, it is going to give you as the minister land. But what we then need is not to tell the public that they'll get the land from the Expropriation Act, but to tell them that we need a Land Redistribution Act, which is the instrument that will move the land into people's hands.
Well, as you can see in the expropriation bill, is that land will be expropriated for the public interest and the public good.
Yes.
And already, you know, I'm currently with a land expropriation that's been in the courts now for 3 years, and finally the courts ruled in our favor.
To expropriate?
Yeah, whereby the fight is about the existing owners that want more than market value. And that's where the courts will come in and settle the dispute. The same with the expropriation bill right now. People still have access to the courts in terms of Section 34 of the Constitution. So really, I think we are in a period where if we can get it right and you know, like you say in your book, is that if we can get the policy right that can drive the how part, how part of how to access and how to share this land. And the expropriation is not the silver bullet for all, it's not the panacea for all our land problems. It is but one mechanism of acquisition that we can also use in the future.
And in fact, it's only a mechanism of acquiring land. It's not even a mechanism of distributing.
Exactly, exactly.
But Minister, what do you think about a land redistribution bill? Now, that's been my new baby that I've been punting around, that actually what this country needs urgently is a land redistribution bill.
So when we say land redistribution bill, government has got power to redistribute state-owned land. And that we must do quick and we must do fast.
Yes.
What are you proposing, that how do we redistribute land that's privately owned?
Yes.
Because that's where the bulk of the land is sitting at the moment.
Yes, and the other thing I wanted to, yes, I agree with you, Minister. I think your point you made is a crucial one, which is we are never going to resolve the problem of landlessness without focusing on private land. Yeah. The idea that the state must just hand over its own land is going to solve 5% of the problem. But 95% means we must go to privately owned land.
Yeah, but that is why there's also now the donations policy, whereby people can donate land to the state. And I must say, it's very encouraging to see how people are coming forward who actually want to donate land to the state in a sort of reconciliation way of building our country. So we have to try, you know, the donation policy, the redistribution of state-owned land. We've seen over 700,000 hectares of land is being distributed for agricultural purposes. And we just need to speed up what is in control of the state-owned land. We must lead by example. You know, you look at the gentrification in our cities also. Our people have been displaced out of the cities. They can't afford to live in the cities anymore. And how do we deal with gentrification? You use state-owned land in those cities to build well-located, affordable housing right there so that you can counter the gentrification, because you are not going to stop it. So I'm really interested to talk to you about this land redistribution bill. But currently we have to align all the different pieces of legislation that we have. They're just not aligned.
Yes, well, you are right. We need to scrap the apartheid pieces first.
Yeah, I still sign off pieces of land in terms of 1937, 1961, and all of that. Those things are still in our statute books and they must get off as soon as possible.
Minister, there are many people asking questions here, and I don't know if, according to our program director, Van, okay, there's Robert Kendi. I know Robert, so he's my friend. So let me ask his question. How do you achieve urban land reform? By one, bringing in the private sector, and two, dealing with anti-foreign national sentiment?
The urban land reform can be speeded up by, that's why I was saying that I'm now pulling in the land owned by state-owned companies, especially within our cities. Now, I know only the city of Cape Town well. We know Kulenburg and Transnet and all of those well-located pieces of land. So if we bring the land into the audit that is owned by state-owned entities, that can definitely help us. But we must access the asset registers of the cities. They're sitting on vast pieces of land. We must access the asset registers of provincial governments. I mean, now they are blaming the national minister for not releasing land. They're playing politics with land, and therefore they can't build housing, for instance, here in the Western Cape. And I simply said to them that, you know, if you can't access your own asset register, I will access it for you, but show you that you've got land. So they're playing politics also with urban land. But I can only say that we need to do a lot more. That's all I can say.
That is another question, which in fact, I think I should ask you this because it's also my own experience. The government buildings are falling apart. State assets are being destroyed. What are you going to do about that?
I agree with you that many government-owned buildings are not being utilized. They are dilapidated, they become danger spots, they are being occupied by drug lords and all of it. And there are many, many of those buildings across the country.
Yes.
Because in the past 20 years, what we have done, instead of repairing and renovating our own government-owned buildings for the use of office space by other government departments, we didn't do that. We went out to go and rent from the private sector. So currently my department spends 1.4 billion rand on renting and leasing in from the private sector. But we only, from the own state-owned properties, we only collect in 60 million rand. So there is this imbalance. So we now have got a mandate that we need to sweat the state assets, meaning that we need to repair them, we need to renovate them, we need to replace them, or we need to repurpose them, for instance, for student housing. So we started the process of identifying 200 buildings all over the country, mostly in cities. We've also identified about 35 properties internationally that's being used by our foreign services. And so that is the first project that we are looking at. How do we utilize the state assets? So there is a program that we are busy with.
Then Zamam Gwaju, the question is, in fact, I also had this question because when you mentioned that, we've got these policies, etc., but we have a problem of implementation. And often that's what I hear from government officials, that, look, we have a problem of implementation. Now, recently, Minister Patricia de Lille, she admitted in Parliament that actually we just don't have people with the right skills. Is that your experience as well?
Well, definitely, but you see, the word that they use in government is to say, oh, there's a lack of capacity. I absolutely hate that. Because, we create the lack of capacity and then we want to complain about it afterwards. But lack of capacity has also become an excuse for inefficiency.
Yes.
Because that, lack of capacity. And I think we need to stop saying that, because if you have got a government department and you have got an organogram that says that for this branch of your department to function, you need 8 people. And if you have those 8 people within that branch of your department, then it cannot be lack of capacity. Then the problem is with the people that you've employed. We must employ the right people with the right skills and the right positions. You know, I'm sitting in my department. I've got 12 of my senior managers, 12 that has been appointed in senior positions without the necessary qualifications. The cases before the labor court for 2 years, we still don't even have a date as to when the labor court is going to hear it. So yes, she is right. There is that problem in government whereby, you know, we simply don't have the right skill. We don't have people that's fit for purpose in some of the positions, and it is impacting on service delivery.
Thank you, Minister. I'm sorry, there are many other questions. I've taken 4 of them and I've asked them. Then I am already 6 minutes out of time. So I think I should stop.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Thank you both. I think what we should do now is to circle back to Kurida and Nomzamo. You've been listening to the Minister, you've been listening to this conversation, you've had opportunity, I think, to see the questions that are being posed. I see quite a few questions are specifically posed to DAG and to SERI. So let's circle back to you and ask if you want to come in and comment at all, or if you want to pose any questions of your own to either the Minister or to Tembeka. So over to you, Kurida.
Thank you. Into the chat group.
Go for it, Kurida.
Sure. I think I want to start by the comment that the Minister made around GIAMA and the fact that it also speaks of best value. And I think we had a long conversation around the value of land and how that's determined, and how even in the case of expropriation, you might find that we often charge more for land than the market value as opposed to less. And I think something that I just want to emphasize here is how we tend to overemphasize the market value of land when it comes to the land market and property in general in South Africa. And that, I think largely that's because of the almost over-reliance or the importance that we've given to formal property rights, and also the extent to which formal property markets within current day South Africa has come to sort of dominate the extent to or the manner in which land markets or land in particular is used and managed, and who benefits from it and not. So I think that's something that we perhaps also just need to highlight firstly, that once we get to a point, and I think Selo started by saying that we should not be scared to have the conversation around land. We should have that conversation. What should bother us is the fact that there's not a long-term strategy in place that speaks to that issue. And I want to link that back to just the idea that as important as land is, I think what we also need to focus on is how we place or how we re-emphasize the social value that land would play and how we use land, and also particularly encourage and draw upon government departments. And I also want to specifically refer to SOEs to get to a stage where we, in some instances, need to place a higher value on the social value of land. So for instance, a person being able to have access to land, how that can affect them in terms of having access to amenities that they might not necessarily have. And then I think I just want to refer back also to the statements the Minister made around the release of military land. DAG, alongside many other civil society organizations, did this work where we looked and specifically tried to come up with schematic and ways in which this land could be used specifically for the development of incremental housing development opportunities once that land is made available. And also just to say that this land, these 3 military land parcels could deliver housing opportunities for over 67,000 affordable homes. So I am really encouraged by the fact that the Minister has noted a support for this call for the release of land. And I'm also aware, according to the Minister's note, statements that there have been further work within the department and others to look at the extent to which this land can actually be used further. What I would just want to emphasize is the overwhelming support from communities and people who live in areas and who need this type of housing made for the release of this housing, of this land rather, and to emphasize to the Minister that we are still willing to work with her or other departments in this regard, that we think that, as she mentioned, where there are parcels that can be made available or pieces of the land that can be made available for human settlements development, noting the Minister's and the department's commitment to the release of this land, we certainly want to continue to engage in a process where we have discussions, not only around this particular land parcel, but also around other land parcels within the countries or within cities that can be made available for affordable housing. I think I'm going to hand back to you, Vern, because I'm concerned about time. If you want me to respond to the questions, I can do that after. But let me for now just hand over back to you.
No, thank you very much. Perhaps you could address one of the questions that are posed specifically to DAG. I'm looking at the question about how can a fair distribution be implemented once available land has been earmarked. This comes from Hans Buehler, who's Hans Seidel Foundation, and they've contributed to funding for these papers. So it'd be great for you to respond to that one.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question to ask. When we were looking at these three military sites and asking ourselves, once we actually get the land, once the land is made available, the key question then is who benefits from the land and how do we ensure that those who benefit do so fairly? So then the next question is, what are the processes in place that need to ensure that this land is distributed fairly and that those who are most in need and most vulnerable are able to access this land? And I think what we had discussed and settled sort of upon is that when these conversations happen, it tends to happen at a very technical level and amongst themselves. And what's really important, and the PHP is an example of this, where you have community partners coming together. There are various allocation policies within different government departments, metros, speaking specifically to how housing or housing in particular should be allocated. And within the housing allocation space, just in and of itself, there are huge challenges and problems. And that's often because communities feel like they've not been engaged in a manner that is meaningful in terms of discussions around how this should be allocated fairly. And I think if we look at the manner in which informal settlements develop and sort of, township development happens in that regard, our people are well able and capable themselves to have these conversations. And I think more so based on what is their priority needs. And I think that's why when we start talking about distribution, it's really going to be important that in addition to having these conversations amongst ourselves and with the government, we actually really draw the people that are going to benefit from this distribution in this conversation. Thank you, Van.
Yurida, thank you. Over to you, Nomzamo.
Can I just maybe make an input right now, Prof?
Okay, sure.
Yes, I just want to give DAG the assurance that, first of all, what I would love to do is get permission from the military, from the Department of Defense, and I will go with the civil society to go and visit those military bases so that you can see for yourself which part of the land is still being used and what part is not being used. That's the first one. I want to give her the assurance that my assessment is that one of the military bases that will move first on will be on Wingfield. Wingfield is a unique piece of land whereby next to Wingfield, you also have the Hindaberry Trust land claim that is being settled many years ago. So they have never developed that land because it was difficult to just bring in bulk services just for the Ndebeni settlement. But there's another piece of land just right next to the Ndebeni Trust land, which currently is called like no man's land. And when I went to go look, I see that this land also belongs to Public Works. So I think we're going to have a breakthrough sooner when it comes to Wingfield. And I'm working hard that at least before the end of this year, we must be able to say, this is the piece of land from Wingfield that we are going to release. But when it comes to Eysterplaat, for instance, you know, you've got a runway there, you've got an airport there. If you build anything close by Eysterplaat, you have to deal with the noise contour and all of that. So my offer to you is that I will arrange for civil society to go with me and visit all of those military sites. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. So now I think almost the last word for our session is going to go to Nomzamo. Just to note before you come in is I'm listening to the discussion about identifying categories of land that can be made available for these purposes. And I feel a deep frustration because I remember the 1992 Ready to Govern document of the ANC, which was already identifying categories that have been mentioned today. Why are we still trying to identify rather than actually redistributing land? So over to you, Nomzamo.
Thanks so much, Rowan. I feel that's a bit unfair because I have a question to pose to the Minister Adv Tembeka. In their inputs, they spoke a lot about cities. We are saying in 9 years' time, 70% of the population will be living in cities. And I want to ask the Minister, in the Ministry's engagement around expropriation, what requests are coming through from the metros? Because we know that they have control over housing. And if they are serious about housing delivery and changing the spatial arrangement within cities, that they'll be making expropriation requests to her. So the question to her is really, what engagements has he had with metros requests, direct requests for metros for expropriation? Two, I mean, we all know that there's been the ongoing complaint is that the problem is the lack of political will. And I think this question is connected. In the current bill that's before Parliament, Tembeka, what is in that bill that is going to address the issue of a failure of the state to expropriate for land reform purposes? Do we have anything to address that? And of course, the Minister can come in as well if she sees, if she feels that as the department that sponsored the bill, how are things going to change from what we've been experiencing under the current act to what will happen when we have the new act. And then the question that have been addressed to me, there was a question around why is interference with the market the only solution? So as I explained, pre-1994, we had the Rent Control Act, and we know that it was able to stem off gentrification to protect the white working class. And through that, there was control around rental increases. There was control around how landlords can, when and how landlords can terminate leases. What we have now is a free-for-all. To the extent that if you look at the inner city of Joburg, in 2013, it cost you 100 rand per square meter to rent in Hillbrow, in Berea, in Braamfontein, in the CBD, which is higher than what at that time was being charged for commercial rentals, and at that time was equal to what was being rented in Centre. And that's because the market is not being regulated. So we know from our experience, but also we know from the experience, if you look at the US example, the New York State, you look at what is happening in Berlin. So internationally, there are examples of if you regulate the rental market, you actually can protect the poor and make sure they can continue to live in those spaces. Secondly, we know that in the urban core, in inner cities, as the Minister mentioned, there's a lot of displacement through evictions. And we know that a space where we can intervene is by responding to those evictions in a way that stems the tide of displacement. And I want to ask again the Minister in her response about municipalities, has the department engaged in cases where she's been asked to expropriate in response to evictions? And I want to then respond to the question of how do you target the poor? We are very clear, I think, in our report that you have you have people living in informal settlements. So in 2011, the census told us that it was about 3.6 million people. That census is now 10 years old. We expect that we talk about 6 to 8 billion people. Those are just people living in informal settlements. We know that we have people living in inner cities, and we have backyard dwellers. And we think what needs to change is our approach of individual beneficiaries to groups. So if we want to target the poor, let's step away from just saying we have someone who's qualified to be subsidized. Let's actually focus on communities, on groups. That's the first thing. Two, already I think both the high-level panel and the presidential advisory panel have said we need to prioritize women-headed households. We need to find ways to prioritize the poor, but most importantly, we actually need to put in place transparency and monitoring mechanisms that can tell us once the land has been expropriated, what's been happening. And I would love to hear in the context of the current bill, what steps are there to address that? Thanks, Gwen.
Nomzamo, thank you. So we're almost out of time, but I know we've got about a 5-minute cushion before we get auto-closed and the whole thing closes down. So Minister, would you like to respond to those really important questions in about 5 minutes? Thank you.
I certainly will. Let me just see if I'm on the. Yes. In terms of the expropriation bill, we have done some public participation and more than 50,000 people have made submissions. We have tried to incorporate some of those submissions, and Parliament is now doing a second round of public participation. But the key with the expropriation bill now is a bill to replace the 1975 Expropriation Act. That is totally outdated, that is not in line with our new constitution, and therefore it needs to be replaced. And also the expropriation bill is a bill, what they call a law of general application, so that it spells out clearly how and when and who can do expropriation under which circumstances. And that is what is before Parliament now. So certainly we still need to get that bill to be passed by Parliament, by the NCOP, and then assented to by the President, and then we can start using the new Expropriation Act. But I do think what I can offer to DAG also and to any other civil society is that what are the requests that I've received for land parcels from the city of land that's owned by national department? Transparency, I can make that list available. I can also make a list available to you of land that we have made available. Like for instance now, all the people that are living on the metro rail lines in the city of Cape Town, I've helped the Minister of Transport with alternative land to move people off there so that they can get access and repair the central line in the city of Cape Town. But that information is certainly not a secret. And any of you can write to me and ask for information, and I can certainly make information available to you. But I look forward to further engagements. I want to thank once again the Nelson Mandela Foundation for putting this together. This is just the beginning. And I do know that Salo will lead us on this one, and I will always make available whatever we can from the side of government to continue to promote urban land reform. I thank you very much, and God bless.
Thank you, Minister. I'm looking at our Chief Executive, Sello Hatang. Is there anything you would like to say? You've been listening to a lot in the last 2 hours before we wrap.
I think the provocation has been put out there, and I think with that provocation that we have from all the contributors, all we can do is to create the platform for the kind of dialogue that we need. You know, it's encouraging to hear both the Minister and Tembeka, but also the contributions that had Nomzamo and Kirida, that all of them are saying the space is there for us to change. We can't continue as if everything is fine. And we must then just thank all of you for participating, but to also say that we will reconvene again, just not for a small, for a talk shop, which is not what we're known for. It's to then put the minister through her paces, as Tembeka did. I was sad that he said he had to pull back a little bit, but he's still he's still kicked hard, and I'm hoping that we'll continue on that front. And Minister, we're looking forward to hosting you when you come to Joburg.
Thank you. So it just remains for me to give a vote of thanks to all our speakers. Thank you so much for the preparation, the hard work that's gone into this, the care. We really appreciate it. To the Minister's office, it's been a real pleasure working with your office, especially Zara Nicholson. If she's not able to hear us right now, please convey our thanks to her again. To colleagues at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Sumaya Hendricks, you did most of the conceptualization work, and a lot of the hard yards to pull this together. Thank you so much. Lee Davies has held this together from an IT perspective, and their teams. And then just again to acknowledge the Hans Seidel Foundation, not only for contributing funding to the research papers, but also for their continuing support for the Dialogue and Advocacy Program, valued partner. And then lastly, to our audience, thank you all for participating. Thank you for the questions. We will continue with this process. This has a long way to go, and for us, it's a priority. A last thanks to Tembeka. If my memory serves me correctly, it was a Board of Trustees retreat in 2018, where you made the argument that the focus for us should be on urban land. We shouldn't be neglecting that. And so thank you again for that. That's been something that has shaped what we've been doing in the last 2 or 3 years. So good evening, everybody. Go well and see you next time.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.